never really had any formal training for that sort of stuff. But when I was in high school, one of the things that had the most impact on me as a creative thinker was I took 2 years of advertising art and design, and what that did for me, that was a really amazing experience. It was an off-campus class, which was kind of unusual. We literally had to take a bus or find our own way to the next town over from where we were, and did that for 2 hours a day. And what was amazing about that was the teacher involved. The teacher involved was all about, really wanting you to figure out what was behind the drawing. The quality of the drawing was less of his concern and more about the idea behind the drawings themselves. What are you trying to say? And as I started doing more and more, wanting to do comics, I always wanted to do comics since I was like age 10. And but when I took that class, it really kind of opened up my eyes on how that mode of thinking can be applied to comics. And as I kept drawing more and more comics and doing more professional work after school, that became more and more of a thing that started to show up in my work. And that's where I think where all the crazy layouts and stuff came from, in combination with being exposed to people like who we just were witness to there with Jim Steranko and Jim Starlin and Will Eisner, and a lot of these guys I was exposed to very young as well. And so I could see how they were doing that in a lot of ways. They were putting ideas into what is behind the drawing itself, and in combination with making a good drawing. So that has a huge impact, and it's pretty much been prevalent in my work for a long time now.
I'm going to geek out for a minute here, but maybe in an unexpected way. So what are the actual materials that you've tried and either kept or passed over in terms of creating your art? I was always like, even before I was drawing comics professionally, I always would try to find tools that I liked. And so, without being able to, I can't really remember specific things I threw out that I just couldn't stand, but it's like one of those things where it's trial and error, and you're just going through different, let's try this pen, that pen's horrible. One of the things that I can say specifically, I tried inking with a quill early on. No way. I don't know how some people can do that. That was mind-boggling for me. So any line work, I pretty much rely on a pen and then go back in with brush and stuff like that. It was interesting trial and error, finding the right kind of ink that I liked that flowed off of a brush nicely. But my everlasting battle, which will probably happen till the day I die, is finding the perfect paper that can handle every medium I want to use, because I'm all over the place with the stuff I use. I go from pencils and inks to pens and brushes to washes and paint, and a lot of times that stuff will be all on one illustration. Sometimes color pencils, things like that. And so trying to find a paper that will suit all those mediums, I think, is probably impossible at this point. So I've had to settle for stuff I've found to be the most forgiving in those areas. So that's kind of what prompted my question. Was I can see so many layers of different media on the display that in whatever panel I'm looking at. I was wondering how you do that without them all smushing together and blurring together. And it must be, do one kind of media wait for it to settle and then do another? Kind of thing?
Yeah, very much so. Particularly in terms of doing any of the tonal work, because I'll use a combination of Copic markers for some of the tonal work in combination with traditional ink wash. And I usually do all that after I've done all the standard style inks. And so it's interesting finding ways how those things can marry together. And it usually has to be done in layers like that, where you start off with one thing, and it's kind of a scary prospect sometimes when you're doing the tonal work, because you don't know once it's down there, it's down there. It's like not much you can do about it. And so you have to find ways to, if it's not looking the way you thought it would, you have to find ways to layer it, like you said, layer it on and get the results that you're looking for.
And if step 3 goes wrong, then you have to go all the way back to the beginning, or?
No, I try to find, if I did that, nothing would ever come out. So I find ways to make my mistakes not be mistakes anymore. So that kind of goes back to the thinking process a little bit. So, you know, you look at what's there, and if it's not coming out the way it's supposed to or the way you intended it to, you either find ways to live with how it looks in front of you, or you find ways to tweak it a little bit to where, you know, you're willing to let it go out the door.
Well, I suppose kind of related to that, the general impression that readers and fans get, and I think more recently you've spoken about this, is that you do take quite a lot of time over some of your pages, especially your spreads.
Yeah.
Do you think that's because you use so many different media per spread, or is that just how your thinking works?
I think it's the additional, I think it's a combination of both. You know, for a long time I used to tell people, you know, oh, I'm so slow, I'm so damn slow. But now I've started thinking about things more, you know, in a different way recently, where I start looking at what I'm putting on the page in terms of the full rendering and all that stuff. And, you know, I'm not just a penciler that someone else comes in and does inking over to where the process can move along faster. Since I'm doing it all, and sometimes practically doing these little black and white paintings with the washes that, you know, I'm really not that slow once you see the final result.
Yeah.
It's just that it's one guy doing all these things. And so that's where the time consumption comes from. So I can, you know, for an average spread, you know, I guess I can average out 2 to 2.5 pages a week, fully completed pages like that. That's the bad habit I've gotten into is since I started doing a bunch of stuff with all this rendering, now when I do just a basic ink drawing, I look at it and I feel like it's incomplete, which is bad because then you're like, you know, I want to sit there and kind of paint everything, you know, and it's like that's not always the best thing either.
Does it look sort of naked to you at that point?
Yeah.
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 It's the beginning.
Yeah, I'll start looking, I'm like, there's nothing there, it's not finished, there's no shadows, you know, the corner over there doesn't have a shadow, or whatever.
Because earlier, well, I don't know how much more recently, but when I look at the list of your credits, there are a fair amount of things that you are credited just as the penciler on, and other people have inked for you.
Yeah.
Is that a relief when that's the case, that you don't have to do all the other steps, or?
No, because I start to fret over how much information is going into the pencils. And that's one of the things I started thinking about when I decided, what prompted me to start inking my own work was for a few different reasons. One, I found the amount of time I was spending on the pencil work to get all those details in there accurately enough to make it to where the inker doesn't have to try to read my mind. I started realizing how much time, I was spending just as much time doing that instead of just doing it all myself. And I was talking with Arthur Adams about this and stuff, and you know, he's like, oh, you need to be inking yourself, you need to be inking yourself. And my wife, Wendy, pointed out to me that almost all the artists that I admired the most inked their own work. And so she's like, you need to make that transition. And I was feeling like there was only a certain limitation of things I could do as just being a penciler in terms of textures to apply, a certain spontaneity to things that I felt the work was sort of feeling a little stifled in a way. And I needed to make the next leap and grow, and that's when I started to do my own stuff. And what was interesting about that process, I quickly got to a point where I didn't really pencil anymore. I just essentially traded the pencil for a pen, and just went with it that way, which is scary because then, you know, if you make a mistake, you can't erase that, and you have to, and that's where the whole thing came in, where I was like, well, okay, that hand looks messed up. How do I make it not look so messed up? You know.
So was the sort of process, the pencils? Okay, I'm going to move to doing my own inks now. Okay, now I'm going to move to doing my own colors. Is that how it went?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of, got to a point where I just feel like the more stuff I know how to do, the more I can create a singular vision, I guess, and allows me to open the doors creatively on experimentation. And that's one thing I've always been after in my work, pretty much from the beginning, is how I can push things in different ways, because I think there's a lot to learn from that, the mentality of that, the process of never stop learning through experimentation. And a lot of times, sometimes stuff doesn't work, particularly when I'm doing weird layouts, some stuff doesn't work as well as it could have, but it was worth trying the experiment. I'd rather try it and it fail than not try it at all. So,
and by that you've escaped the problem of a comic book artist of having to do the same thing over and over again, which often gets to them after a while.
Yeah,
right?
I think I would pull my, well, I don't have hair up here, I'd pull my beard out. But yeah, I think would be really, really bored if I had stuck to the same thing indefinitely. I don't know how some of those guys do it. Back to talking with Arthur, I was talking to him about that, and he always feels like he's still perfecting his style, and I think that's how some guys kind of come at it, where I kind of like, I want to dabble with this, or, well, what would this look like with messy inks, or what would it look like with paint, and just kind of, I'm all over the place that way. I can't help it.
Well, the results are astonishing, and definitely win readers and win fans for you because of the visionary nature of what you're presenting to them.
Thank you.
Your style is unmistakable. Anything we look at, we can tell that your time and effort has gone into that because you're more willing to experiment. But I guess my question for you is, so is your work on Sandman Overture then the most experimental that you've done so far? Are you still heading into experiment with that book?
It's definitely experimental. I don't know if it's the most experimental so far. I think there's some things that we did in Promethea with Alan Moore that I think would still definitely challenge some of the things that are going on in Overture as far as experimentation. It's sort of deciding how to experiment with something really depends on the type of story that's being presented to you. And you don't want to have the experimentation overpower what the story needs. And so I always, when I experiment, the first and foremost thing is the experiment has to work in tandem with what the story actually needs. And then you start to see how far you can push out the walls a little bit. In Overture, we're only 2 issues in. I have no idea how crazy things are going to get. But I know when I started working on issue 2, issue 1 has this nice, interesting flow to it. And it was difficult work, but then when I saw what was going to be needed for issue 2 is just extremely dense, and it doesn't let up. And there's not a single page in that was not difficult to do for one reason or another. So, and sometimes it's not necessarily the experimentation, but just in terms of the type of information that needs to be conveyed.
Yeah, I'm nodding a lot, having looked at issue 2, which hopefully some of you have seen as well. There are spreads where you have many dozens of versions of Dream present.
That was
and I guess first let's talk about layout. How did you decide to present all that so it wasn't visually confusing for the reader to see so many? It's a crowd scene in a way, but you don't want them to gloss that over. You want them to see,
Yeah, one of the things I thought about early on with issue 2 is one of the things I like to do, and I've done this trick many, many times, where you'll have a full scene and then you'll have a figure move through the scene but use panels to break that action up. And so when I saw how many Sandmans, Neil indicated a few that he wanted to see and left the rest up to me, but he really wanted to give this impression of Sandmans from many, many different worlds, not just a few. So like in issue, there we only get a small sampling. There's 30-something Sandmans there, but on parts of issue 2, there's one spread that goes over 50. And so the best way I thought to do that was just do it as one crowd shot, and then have the lead the action through the panel breaks through the scene. So that was, I thought, the best way to handle it. and and then on occasion take one of those panel breaks and make it its own panel where all of a sudden you've changed angle, and then you might be able to get to see a couple different Sandmans that aren't in the giant shot too, So yeah, that spread took me forever. That was difficult.
It's a poster, basically. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a full work on its own. It
Yeah.
stands by itself. So, how did you render distinctive all of these different versions of Dream? Visually designing them yourself, like characters? You just designed each one separately?
Yeah, pretty much. But when I design characters, this drives people nuts, and it can drive the publisher nuts sometimes too, because I'm not one of those guys that do character sheet designs. I design on the board as the story dictates what needs to be done. So, I can't imagine how much it would have taken me a month if I had to just design a sheet for each of those characters.
Yeah.
So I just started, like, whatever came to my mind of, at the moment, I just would draw that character. There was a couple that are particular, homages, let's say. Like there's, a Mark Hempel Sandman in there because I love Mark Hempel's work on the early stuff so much, things like that. But then there's places where, like, I wanted this one Sandman to look like he's we called it, Dave and I, the colorists, call him Cancer Sandman because he looks like this walking cancer thing. Stuff like that, just whatever would come to my head. And as I started thinking of these different types of details, I would start thinking about, maybe that should be drawn with these kind of techniques and things like that, and try to apply different styles to each one. Some of them are more subtle, and some of them are more overt, in terms of noticing the different styles.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like Neil didn't ask you, here are my 50 different Sandmen that I want you to draw in, representing different worlds, different things. You actually were given the freedom to create that visual.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. There's spots where when he first, like for this spread in particular, and then when he wrote the scene for issue 2, he said we have to have a Jack Kirby Sandman and that sort of thing going on. And a lot of that comes also from, like, before he started writing the series, he asked me to do a list of things I was interested in, objects or subjects, and so I just gave him this big long list, and he's been slowly checking it off in different ways. So, like, the Kirby Sandman was, I think came from that because I told him I love Jack Kirby and, things like that. And so he's been finding ways to reference stuff that way. And but I think my favorite thing to do was to do, well, he knew I liked to do cats, and so he wanted the cat Sandman, and but it was my idea to make the cat extremely giant.
Yeah.
I just thought that would be so cool to see this giant, weird-looking cat.
Who becomes more prominent.
Yeah, it's going to be sort of Morpheus's companion for at least the first half that I know of, and then. The other thing I wanted to toy with was, since we're getting to do these different styles of Sandman, is like, you have the Jack Kirby sort of looking guy, but then you'll have the Picasso Sandman, things like that. So it was kind of fun to do because when you look at each one of them, you really get the impression that each one comes from their own sort of world or reality. And I think that says so much when you're dealing with a large group of characters that way, because a lot of these guys, that's the only time you're going to see them. They don't have a speaking role or whatever, and so when you handle the style of a character differently next to the style of a character standing next to him, it's sort of, even if they don't speak, it sort of tells you something subliminally inside of your mind about what they might be like.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of cool. You can't do that anywhere else but in comics, though.
This brings to mind the fact that many of the different versions of Dream speak differently in different fonts. There's this Todd Klein coming out with these amazing fonts and things.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Todd is a master of that. He's right over there.
Hi there.
Yeah, that was so much fun knowing that, when I was laying it out, there was different characters that, since Neil gave me some freedom on who was going to I was going to draw, there was places where he said, oh, put whatever Sandman you want here, but they'll be saying this. Or there's other times where he's like, I want an electric Sandman. So I came up with the robot Sandman, and he ends up getting to speak. And then when I drew this spread in particular, some of the dialogue that you see here from some of the characters actually wasn't in the original script.
Okay.
But when Neil saw all the different styles, he said, oh, this guy has got to say something. And, that inspired Todd because he saw different drawing styles and stuff. And so he really wanted to make sure that each one had a different quality to them. And I think my favorite is the Picasso Sandman lettering there. I think that's just amazing. But Todd is so good at that stuff. And, you never know what you're going to get from him in terms of creativity, other than that it'll be amazing.
It becomes such a rich experience for the reader when these layers of details are added and you guys are bouncing off each other to add even more.
Yeah, exactly.
Going with that. So
that's why I don't like to work with anyone other than Todd.
it's understandable. Well, this is the Dream, who's more the focus of the narrative, the sort of perspective character in a way. You seem to follow him around over his shoulder sometimes. It makes you feel like you're with him or you are him, which is interesting.
Yes.
What about the design of the central character? Like, what were you going for with him, or were you given specifics on what to make him look like?
I wasn't really given specifics on what to make him look like, other than when we first see him in the story, it's Morpheus in the year 1915. Mm-hmm. And so the first time you see him in the story, he's in 1915 clothing, and that actually led to Neil wanted his hair to be shorter. That was something specific from Neil, which I thought was cool. But it was my thought that I started looking at a lot of illustrations from that time period, and a lot of the men had substantial sideburns or interesting facial hair. And so I'm like, we've got to give him sideburns. He's got to look like he's been spending some time in 1915. But the style of him, the way I wanted to draw him, I really wanted him to feel, for lack of a better term, but somewhat smoky. Like the blacks, and there's like this sort of the smokiness coming off of him. And the other thing I really wanted to do is the early issues of Sandman, his cloak always had these flame details, and for a while they kind of went away, and then they came back later in the series. And so when I spoke to Neil about it, I had this interesting idea. I was like, what if we make parts of the cloak actually be fire? And I thought that was kind of an interesting visual. So the contrast of his dark, smoky textures with this fire coming off the bottoms of his cloak, I think looks really, really cool. And what I like about doing that sort of smoky, washy effect is that there's, not consistently, but there's some places where sometimes along the edge you might see a little bit of the background creeping through, as if his edges aren't quite there, which I thought was appropriate for a character. It's all about dreams and what is real and not real.
Wow, I'm glad I'm recording this. This is an amazing conversation. Into insights into this, what we're getting visually in this comic. I'm talking a lot about Sandman, so I kind of apologize, but it is the hot thing that everyone's talking about right now. Aside from Sandman, a majority of your work has been in superheroes.
Yeah.
And I wonder why superheroes. Are there other genres that interest you? Why haven't you devoted more time to other genres? Like how that choice has worked for you? Yeah.
It sort of was one of those things, like, when I was a comic book fan growing up, the majority of the stuff you would read is superheroes, much like it is for a lot of people today. But I don't necessarily have a distinct interest in superheroes. I know that there's a lot of interesting story potential that can be garnered out of them because they're sort of a modern mythology in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But I'm getting to a point where I'm much more interested in just a good story. It doesn't have to be superheroes for me. It just sort of, I ended up sort of in that area. I'm not quite sure. It wasn't like a purposeful game plan. Mm-hmm. But as, early in my career when people started getting, publishers got interested in my work, of course they're going to gravitate you to the superhero stuff because that's where they make their money. And but I have a much broader interest. You know, some of the things I want to do, or you know, definitely would not be considered superheroes. Heroic fiction, mythical fiction for sure, but not the traditional superhero thing. And honestly, I think comics need to move more towards that. It's too reliant on the superhero thing, and that's why I love working on something like Sandman and even Promethea. When Promethea technically was a superhero, but when you read it, it's nothing like a superhero comic you've read before. But I also, I have an interest in crime fiction, and so when I did work on Desolation Jones, that was a great opportunity to kind of toy with that. I'd love to do some more stuff like that.
I noticed that popping up in your publication history, little things here and there that made me think you were interested in that. So it's more like that superheroes are such a large part of the industry that when people are approaching you for work, it's more likely to be superhero work than anything else.
Yeah. Which, I mean, nothing against superhero comics, but I feel that's a little bit unfortunate because comics have so much more to offer. It's a medium that you can do anything in, and but things have been so entrenched in the superhero world for such a long time that I think the industry is still trying to find ways to grow out of that. But I think it's here. It's on. I mean, we're seeing it when you look at all the stuff that's coming out from Image Comics. I mean, how very little of that is superheroes, and they're fantastic books, and they're doing very, very well. And that makes me happy because then now I can see where I can move to and feel like I can do it.
The number of books that, since I work as a reporter, I would also have a local comic shop I spend a lot of time in. The number of books that come out every week, the number that are non-superhero is now, it's becoming 50-50 at least.
Right.
All the other genres are coming up to the 50% mark versus the superhero comics. So yeah, there's so much more available for readers, and that's exciting because the more that's available, the more likelihood it'll spread and people start creating more as well.
Yeah, and I think some of the, my style manipulation thing that I do where I toy with stuff, some of the things I'm pulling from aren't superhero comics. I pull from a lot of different sources, and so that's what I think this is some way that I kind of get some of my own self-satisfaction in the creative process because I want to be able to draw different things,
It's opening doors for you as well.
Yeah.
There's more out there. We're going to go back in time for a minute then. Can you tell us about the journey of working on Promethea for such a long period of time? At that time, you hadn't worked on such a long run before, right? Was that a time when you were kind of experimenting and teaching yourself new ways to cope with situations that you wanted to portray? I mean, the book is such an experiment. Every issue is different. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely was a huge, huge learning experience. And, since it happened earlier in my career, I mean, it came along at that time where I needed that to happen for myself because it allowed me to grow in so many ways. And when I saw, what we could do, and I started talking to Alan, and I saw that, so a lot of the stuff involving Promethea had a lot to do with appreciating art in general. There was a lot of that sort of philosophy going on in some of the context of the series and the character that really opened up my mind to say, hey, we can try this or we can try that. And I would have conversations with Alan about that. And I think he really appreciated that I came at it with saying, challenge me as much as you think I can be challenged. And I think Alan really relished that and interjected a lot of that into the story. So like when we did the whole middle section of the series that Alan and I would call the Kabbalah Quest, where we went on to each world of reality. There was like 10 different worlds we went to. I said we need to make each world a completely different style and really push people's expectations of what that can be. And I learned a lot there because it really taught me that I can we can try anything, whether it always works, who knows, but let's try it. And because that's the one, like I was saying earlier, I mean, comics can be anything. That's what's so great about comics. You can do anything, and so why limit yourself?
Certainly, I think Promethea poses that question. I think the fact that it exists challenges creators and artists and writers, because it seemed, if you step back, if you read like a proposal for Promethea as it stands, people would say this cannot be done. It just can't. But you didn't entertain that thought.
No.
So that's why it exists. It's
Right.
just,
Yeah.
a lot of great creators have done that too.
Yeah.
Just haven't entertained that possibility that it's not can't be done. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always of the mindset, it's like, I'm not just willing to go up to the cliff, I'm willing to go over it. So, and Alan is very much that way too, when you really look at all the things that he's done. I mean, come on. And when I got the opportunity, when that first came to my doorstep to work with him, I knew right then that I'm like, this is going to be an opportunity to where I can really push things, because I knew he would be open to it. And, and the results are really cool, so.
It's a monumental thing, and of course there's the big art edition, right? That's coming out. It's sort of
Yes.
Horizontal format and
Yes.
fold out and all
Yes.
this stuff going on.
Yeah. Because I don't know how many of you are super familiar with all my works, but for a long time now, pretty much since the beginning of Promethea, the double page spread has been sort of my thing, where I've wanted to find ways to command that. And so, of course, there's been numerous different editions of Promethea throughout the years since the series ended, but one of the things we started thinking about is doing the book to where it's a landscape format. So each double page spread will now be a single page and fully allowing you to read the book in a way you have never read it before. And what we're proposing to do is no one's done this before. This is going to be a new format. And it was actually supposed to be out sooner than it's going to be, because Sandman is taking up time, and I have to do new work for the Promethea book.
I was wondering if you were involved in helping create that new
Yeah,
collection.
yeah. There's gonna be some new artwork. Primarily, they want a new wraparound cover, and a new wraparound slipcase, which is the equivalent of doing 8 inked covers and colored covers. That's a month,
Yeah.
And so they're like, Sandman can't afford a month, and so we'll just wait until Sandman's done. And I think it'll get more attention when Sandman's done anyway, to come off of all the popularity of Sandman. But one of the cool things that this book is going to have that we're getting to do is issue 12 of Promethea. When we designed that issue, we had always intended it to be this accordion fold-out thing.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, they said that we couldn't publish it that way, so it never got published that way. So when we set out to do this book, I brought that up, and they're actually going to do it, which is going to be amazing. So you're going to get to that point in the issue, and they're going to say, in the book, pull out the folder that comes with the book, and it's going to be 16 feet long. So yeah, because this book is the height of Absolute, but twice as wide. So it's going to be pretty amazing.
You might have to buy new homes first. So we're preparing you. You need a big enough space for this book.
I think, format-wise, it's going to be a game changer. If it does well, I'm hoping that they'll do some of my other works in a similar format, because I do the double-page thing so much. So I'd love to see that with Sandman or Batwoman stuff. I think it'd be cool.
Well, I haven't talked enough about Batwoman, probably. I'm sorry, I've been geeking out over the other stuff, but I know you all are into Batwoman. You were talking about telling different kinds of stories, and for me, it seems like Batwoman brought in a lot of elements that were not always typical of superhero stories, like folktale elements. I heard you talking once about some of the mythology behind it, that it was stuff you were interested in, that you had heard from like the Hispanic community, right?
Yeah.
Things like that. So, as you've progressed in your career, have you had more freedom to bring weirder elements into superheroes? I mean, you were a writer on that too, which helped.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, some of my favorite superhero comics, as a reader, have always been the stuff that would sort of push the convention of what superhero comics are supposed to be. Writers like Grant Morrison or Alan Moore, some of these guys, they would take the genre and push it into different territories. And so when we got the opportunity to do Batwoman, I thought it'd be great to do that with, especially because when Greg Rucka was writing the character on Detective Comics when I was drawing it. He introduced some of these supernatural elements in there, and that was kind of an unexpected thing. You don't normally see that in Gotham City. But of course, Gotham City is going to have stuff like that. It's the DCU, right? I mean, any weird stuff can happen, so why not? And it reminded me of some of the comics in the 70s. I mean, there were some weird Batman stories in the 70s that had stuff, or even some of Doug Moench's stuff would have strange things like that. And I was like, well, just because it's Gotham City, it doesn't all have to be grim and gritty crime fiction. It can be grim and gritty crime fiction with a werewolf, Why not, And so we really wanted to push that. And then that led us to thinking of, mixing genres further. So each story arc sort of had its own thing going on, genre-wise. And I thought that was kind of cool. If you're going to do a long-running series, or an intent for a series to last a while, it's, I think, a good idea to show that a character doesn't have to be just one thing, and brings more three-dimension to the character. If you can put them in different situations, have a character like Batwoman who has no superpowers has to fight this ghost. How does she fight a ghost? You can't punch it. How does she resolve that? That sort of stuff, and then move from that to a James Bond like plot, but chop it up like you would a Tarantino movie. To a classic fantasy tale after that, where she's teamed up with Wonder Woman and fighting mythological gods and stuff. It's just really. Why not? That's what makes it fun.
And you're really opening doors in that character for future, generations as well, because you can't unsee it once it's been done, right?
Right.
Start to realize all the potential
Yeah.
in these characters at the time.
And what's really fun about doing that stuff, where you take something like Batwoman, who's this grounded character, she has no superpowers, and you throw her in the middle of something that really should be handled by the Justice League, fighting Medusa and these hordes of mythological monsters and stuff. What makes it so entertaining for me is that balancing it out with the fact that she's a normal human being, even though she's doing some crazy stuff. And so getting into her, her home life and the people around her and the things that make her a normal person. And so I think when you take that and combine that with the mythological, you actually can believe in the mythological more, because you have something to counteract the ground. It sort of grounds it all, I think that's kind of a cool thing to do.
That's one of the things about Promethea that keeps it on track as well.
Yes.
Those human elements as well.
Yeah.
It's amazing balance. Well, I want to leave time for questions, but before, can you tell us a little bit about your design work and your CDs and things you've been doing, CD covers?
Sure. I mean, I'm a big music fan, have been my whole life, and I wanted to do that sort of thing for a long time, and have been trying to for a while. But for whatever reason, it just didn't work out. Like, either schedules didn't work out, or there ended up being communication problems or whatever. And so it just never really happened for me. But I kept, if the opportunity came, I would try, And then a couple years ago, I got contacted by this fantastic band, The Sword. I don't know if any of you guys know them, but they're amazing. And they're big comic book fans. And their manager emailed me out of the blue and said, JD, the singer, is a huge fan of mine, and the band loves my work. Would I consider doing their album cover? And I was like, absolutely yes. I was already a fan of them. And what was that was a really great experience, because they were so open to what I wanted to do. And the trick to it is, a lot of times when I hear from a music band who's seen my comic book work, they maybe have seen one project, they haven't seen all of them.
Yeah.
And with my projects being so diverse, I sort of have to, that's the first thing I have to talk about with them, is like, it's not going to be Batwoman, or it's not going to be Promethea, it's going to be The Sword, through what I think would be appropriate for the record. And they were completely open to that, which was great, because most of the times they're like, oh, you're not going to do, Batwoman thing? I'm like, no, and they end up being disappointed. Where they were really open and communicating with me a lot about different ideas and stuff. And so the result is they got something that was completely appropriate for The Sword, but you can still sort of see some of me in there too. And that project actually got brought to me after the Blondie project was brought to me. But the Blondie one still hasn't come out yet because they operate on a whole different time reality. Ended up doing the sword work before that, before the Blondie thing, and then it came out before the Blondie thing. But the way I got the Blondie project was, I went to a show. I'm always been a huge Blondie fan, and we had bought VIP tickets, and so I knew that they kind of liked comic books too, and so we brought them a copy of Batwoman, and we got to have our meet and greet before the show instead of after the show, and so we showed it to them, and it's all kind of awkward fan meeting, rock and roll gods sort of thing, and then we went and watched the show, and then after the show, we were out by the merch booth talking to the opening band, and they're like, "You guys have VIP tickets. What are you standing here for?" And we're like, "Oh, we were told only before the show." And he's like, "No. And so he walked us back there, and so we're hanging out, and there's a whole bunch of other fans who had tickets and whatever back there, and the band comes out, and Chris Stein, one of the founding members of Blondie, saw that we were there, and he made a beeline for me. And he's like, "We looked through that book while the opening band was playing." He's like, "That Batwoman stuff is awesome, And I'm like, "Oh, flipping out on my side, but trying to be cool, So we're talking, and I was with James Syme, who owns one of the best comic stores in California, the Isotope in San Francisco, and he's a huge Blondie fan, and he started really, I was like getting really embarrassed because he's like, "Chris, this guy's a big deal in comics," and all this stuff. And he's like, "He's worked with Alan Moore," and Chris Stein goes, "You know Alan Moore?" And it was like the whole thing changed from there. And we were talking and stuff, and then so I have this tendency to sort of just some of the best I'm mixing up my words, but some of the best projects I've gotten is just from just throwing myself out there. I can just be really stupid and blunt sometimes, and so I just blurt it out. I'm like, "Well, if you ever need an artist," here I'm talking the Blondie of all people, and Chris Stein goes, he's paused for about 5 seconds, and he goes, "Next album cover." Just like that, and I'm like, "Oh my God," and of course you think, "Oh, they're just being nice, that can happen and stuff." But by the time we got home, he had already left messages on my phone machine, and to such a degree, because they had another album that was about to come out at that time, and they did this special edition of it where it comes with this magazine and stuff, and they even put Batwoman art in there, saying this is the guy who's doing the next cover, and all that stuff, but it still hasn't come out. All the work is done. I did the work about, 8-9 months ago, and it's finally going to be coming out very, very soon. So I'm super stoked for that. And what's so fun about doing something like the sword and then doing work for Blondie is how, again, I can get the opportunity to show diversity, because they're two very different music styles going on. And but the funny thing is my interest in storytelling as a comic creator kind of impacted how I approached the art on those, because I kept wanting to find ways to make a narrative out of the artwork for the music, and that's been really cool. So I got to design the entire package. It's not just the art, I got to have a say over every detail of it. So pretty cool.
When you see that in the shops, that's going to be a really big deal, right?
Oh, I'm going to be like shaking. And the last funny little thing I'll say about working with Blondie, you would think this iconic rock and roll band would have so much to say about what goes on the covers, and I tried to have a phone meeting with them, talking, to go over ideas and stuff. And Chris Stein's like, he's like, "I really don't know what I can contribute to this conversation. Just do what you want to do, And it was so funny. And it's like, what?
Yeah, because usually they want to control the branding so much of how things appear, right?
Yeah.
Well, you might not realize it, but you're actually kind of super famous, Jim. I think maybe the Blondie experience will convince you at this point to start acknowledging that. We do just a couple questions then. Okay, is anyone? Mm-hmm.
You said you wanted to veer away from superhero stuff. Do you ever think of working on Fables or maybe something like Swamp Thing, because the way the environments are done, and they always have those really cool borders on Fables and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You could run with stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that sort of stuff. I got to do 2 pages for Fables, issue 100. I think it was issue 100, where they had some different people come in and, like, Bill Willingham had asked some people that he knows, friends of his, what's an unanswered question about Fables that you want to see answered? And he did these little 2-page story things, and I did one of those. I love that kind of stuff. That was fun because I got to kind of toy with a different art style for that and make it a little bit more whimsical. So yeah, that stuff was very appealing.
One more? Got one more? Yep.
How exactly do you come up with like the character designs for all of like the different people you make? Because it always seems that their appearance really fits their personality like perfectly.
Well, that's kind of an interesting question because for me, I always try to look at all these characters as if they are people. I think if a character isn't looked at as an actual existing person, then there's something wrong with that character. If you can't look at them and believe that they could be real in some form. And so I always kind of approach it as if, who are these people and what makes them tick, and try to bring that into the equation. And sometimes it depends on, like when I worked on Batman the Black Glove with Grant Morrison, some of the characters he dealt with there, he talked about these characters coming from different eras and so forth. And so I started imagining what's this character, the character's been around all this time in the DCU, but hadn't been seen in years. And so I kind of pretended like, well, what if they had comics this whole time that we have not seen? What did those comics look like? And then I started to develop what the characters look like from that. So that's one trick to doing it. So.
Do we have time for one more? One more? Surely somebody.
The last Sandman was epic. It took 5 months. So are the next issues as epic, and is it going to take that long between?
Well, yes, it's going to be epic. Each issue, you probably noticed this with issue 2 versus issue 1, how each issue of those two felt quite different from each other. The script for issue 3 feels quite different than issue 2, and I think that's probably what's going to happen all the way down the line. And as far as, how long it takes to do it, a lot of stuff comes up where, life stuff comes up, or the holidays have come up and things like that. And the work takes, a long time, and we have to, find ways to do the work as best as we can under the time constraints, but at the same time, it's Sandman, and it needs to have the time it needs for it to be as best as it can be. It's one of those. I look at Sandman as being one of those characters in the series. It's a huge legacy character, and I find working on it a bit intimidating and daunting. And so I think that kind of can play a role in how much effort goes into each page. And I've also always been kind of the mindset that I understand that the story has to be told, but I also don't want to shortchange the story in order to serve time. When we live in an era where comics, once the story is complete, no one's going to remember how long it took to do that story. They'll just enjoy that story for as long as they're around. And something like Sandman is just going to continue to be on the top shelf of everything, I think. So, and I would kind of want to honor that and make it the best I can make it. So.
To that point, I've followed Sandman since '88, since it came out.
Yeah.
And to see classic Morpheus on the comic pages it was nostalgic, and it was absolutely epic.
Cool.
So I'd rather have you take your time and do it right.
Thank you.
Than just push something out.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm having a good time with it because, it's really amazing because Neil started writing it to where we get Morpheus on almost every page.
Yes.
You know, that's pretty amazing because, you know, the early stuff, there was whole sections where Morpheus isn't in it, which was great, but I love that he's giving me the opportunity to draw Morpheus himself so much, and so I'm really trying to make it feel important, so.
It's almost like we need to think of our children here, because they're going to be reading the collection of this and benefiting from it, so I think we can wait a little bit. Can we really thank Jim for coming out all the way here?
Thank you.
Will you study at your table? Will you study at your table after this?
Yeah, you could probably catch me out there. I do want to walk around a little bit. I haven't seen anything, so, but yeah, you can. If anyone wants to come and talk to me some more, I'll be over at C319 or something. I think is what it is. So.
In the C room. Thanks for coming out. Have a good time.
Thank you.
Hannah Means-Shannon. Leading cool. Check it out. Absolutely.
It's definitely
Hannah
reviewing.
Means-Shannon. Sure.
Just a thing was on there.